Hey Ben, he thinks that's a joke.
All right, welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and I'm joined today by Anthony Marquetta and Jim Breyfogle, the author of Mongoose and Meerkat, an ongoing ball of short stories that are rolling downhill for quite a few years now. Fantastic collection with excellent Kickstarter awards and general support. Anthony, how are you doing today?
Well, as you know, I have never had a bad day in my life.
Fantastic. Jim, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Excellent. As always with these streams, we've had you on before, but I would like to ask you to take some time and talk about Mongoose and Meerkat, the overall story arc, and what they can expect going into Volume 3.
Yeah, so Mongoose and Meerkat for the listeners and viewers who have are not familiar with it is a series of stories that was originally published in Kursova. They've been going on for yikes, I don't even want to know how many years, and I don't want to do the math. It's been several years, um, and they are kind of the traditional adventuring duo, sword and sorcery. That they go out and they have adventures. They're told from the point of view of Mangos, who is the mongoose. He starts off, he's a relatively young, inexperienced guy who's just all he wants at the beginning of the series is to have adventures. He wants to go out into the wide world and see what's there. Um, you know, fame, fortune, antique swords, pleasurable company, all the sorts of things that just go with a carefree lifestyle. Which, since this is second world fantasy and kind of the medieval tradition, it's a world that lends itself to that sort of adventure. Cat is a little more mysterious because the Mangos is the POV character, so we know the world and we discover it through his eyes, and he doesn't know a whole lot about her. The very first story, you know, the traditional norm is that you meet in a meeting place, which is often an inn, but these days editors are like never start at an inn.
Ugh.
So yeah, I mean, it makes it hard because their theory is that we've seen this before, and nobody wants to read about the tavern meeting or anything like that. But when you're in a medieval setting where everybody meets in taverns, it makes it difficult.
Yeah.
Um, so they meet in a tavern, but it's the day after. So Mangos starts off um, basically hungover, trying to remember what stupid things he said the night before. And Kat is there. She had been there the night before, but she knows what happened. So in the course of their conversation, you discover that Mangos made a fairly dumb bet because he thought that he could find a powerful artifact that he has no idea where it is. But Kat does. So that leads to them teaming up, and it sort of kicks off the whole series of adventures that each adventure, so each one that appeared in Kursova magazine is completely separate from the rest of them. If you miss number one and you picked up number two, you wouldn't miss the story. You wouldn't be like, this is a great story, but I have no idea where it started from. Likewise, if you picked up number eight, it's the same sort of thing. Um, but they're fulfilling Mangos is kind of dream here, is they're going from one adventure to another to another to another. And the world is wide and the adventures are many, and they get all sorts of different settings, all just challenges, all sorts of different rewards, if they get a reward at all, because when they start off, they don't know each other, they don't know each other's strengths or weaknesses. So sometimes surviving is its own reward, and sometimes you get part of your reward. But as they progress, they get better. They get more experience with each other. They get just more experience in general, and they start to accumulate the rewards they're looking for, or as I should say, maybe Cat is looking for, because Mangos is more out for adventure and monetary rewards, but Cat is looking for specific things, which slowly, as you work your way through the series, if you're paying attention, you start to figure out. Well, hopefully, as you're reading your way through, you start to wonder. It's like, Mangos doesn't know who Cat is, but I'm kind of curious. So hopefully the readers would take the opportunity to maybe start to piece together some clues and try and figure out what's going on in the background, because Kat does have some things that she wants to accomplish. Um, and as you're reading through, you notice that Mangos is starting to develop. He's not quite as impulsive. He makes better decisions. He acquires new skills. But Kat is also starting to piece together things that, if you're following the clues, then you're also noticing what they're accomplishing, and maybe you can start to wonder, like, why would she want that sort of thing? Um, and that's gotten us through the first two volumes. The first volume is Pursuit Without Asking. The second volume is Heat of the Chase, and this is the third and final volume, The Redemption of Elness, which all those things start coming together for the big climax. Mangos's skills hopefully have elevated him to the point where he can meet the challenges in the last book, and now we know exactly what Kat was after and why she wanted those things, and how the challenges are growing. So what they're trying to do in this volume is exponentially harder than anything that they have tried before, and the skills that they're going to need are not just the ones that they've been using, but new ones that they need to bring to the table to try and accomplish their goals.
Fantastic. Uh, it's a winning formula. I don't really take much stock into things like, oh well, everyone's seen it. Well, yeah, if you're just doing a boring scene, or you're spending way too much time in a tavern no one's ever going to see again, yeah, okay, fine, I can see it. But quite frankly, this isn't like you're having a character wake up from a nightmare of ill portent. Uh,
Right.
or some other thing, or describing the dawn, or anything like that. That actually is quite useless. Um,
And what I wanted to do is I mean, there's a certain comfort in reading familiar tropes that I mean, I'm not trying to, create a whole new branch of literature here. I'm trying to create a
right.
series of stories that are fun and that have a different twist on them, so that I mean, everybody loves dragons.
Mm.
And there's a story with where Cat and Mangos have to fight a couple dragons. They're threatening a smithy that turns out to have important skills for Cat. But the whole story is they're being commissioned to kill two dragons, and that's always an exciting thing to have happen. I mean, no matter how
Yep.
many times we see it, having a good dragon slaying is pretty rousing.
Oh
Um,
yes.
and 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 I consider it kind of flattering that in one of the write-ups when the magazine came out, somebody was saying, we've seen dragons being killed, but we've never seen dragons being killed like this. I'm like, that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted the fun and excitement of dragon killing, but in a way that people haven't seen before, so that it's still worth reading.
Yep. It's fantastic. Uh, and I know you deliver on quite a few occasions. So each one is a little short story. Is that right?
Yes. So there are 18 different stories. We have made it up to 15 in the magazine. 16 will come out in the spring magazine, and then there'll be a break for the summer issue. And 17 and 18 will come out in autumn and winter. So we're not trying to stiff the magazine readers by saying you have to buy the book to get the ending, but if you do buy the book, you will get the ending, 6 months, excuse me, I'm sorry, 6 months earlier than anybody else. And each story that we have seen up to this point is truly a self-contained story that you could pick up 10, not have heard of Mangos or Cat before, and just think that this is a great story.
Oh
by
yeah.
the time we get by the time we get to 16, 17, and 18, those are more strongly linked to the other ones. So by the time you get to 16, you there's no doubt that things have led up to here. It may still be a complete story, but you'd be saying, I don't understand how they got to this point to start this episode. And when you get to 17 and 18, you can't have um, 17 without 18.
Hmm. And that's sort of an inevitability with a lot of the things that you're doing. Not every story has to end um, with a blank slate for this. Sometimes you do have to advance the plot, so to say, even with a short story or a series of short stories. So,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
mhm.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was about to say, like, even Conan the Barbarian, has a clear progression of his character, and if you wanted to, you could easily create a history that makes a lot of sense. It's not a series of vacuums.
Right. And for this one, they're all, I mean, they were intended to be separate. I mean, when I started writing it, it was kind of, haven't published a whole lot of other stuff, and as a beginning writer, it's sort of your pipe dream to be able to get all of them published separately. So that was an intent that they could be.
Mm,
But as you're writing an overall story arc, because after I got several into it, I'm like, we've seen this sort of thing before where all you do is you just have adventures ad nauseum that don't go anywhere, and they're fun, but they don't go anywhere. And so it occurred to me that maybe they should go someplace.
mm.
Um, and,
Right.
and not in not in the we know they're going someplace, but woven into the background until you get to the end of it. But when you're going someplace and you're bringing all these things together so that you can publish them either in, a three-part anthology or all together as an omnibus or something like that, it does mean you're working towards a climax. And the climax needs to be bigger than any of the parts. So the climax of the entire series needs to be bigger than like the climax of chapter 4.
Yep.
And to make it a bigger thing, um, story chapter, whatever you want to call it, 18 by word count is probably 25 or 30% longer than any of the other chapters are, and it's still too short to do what it needs to do. So that's why 17 and 18 are so closely tied together that you can no longer separate them and say you could read 17 and you would be satisfied with it. You could read 17 and it's a great episodic episode, but you will not be satisfied until you read 18 after it. And that's part of the function of trying to bring all of these things into one story and
Mm-hmm.
having a fitting conclusion for it. That conclusion has to be larger, which means those two chapters needed to be more strongly linked to form that one conclusion than the smaller conclusions at the end of every single chapter.
Right. I get you. Hmm. So you are definite. So are you putting an end to the characters after this volume, or will you continue the story in a different story arc?
So that's been asked before.
Hmm.
At this point, I don't have um, plans to carry anything beyond chapter 18. So the redemption of Alnus was intended to be the end of the series. If it was on Netflix, they'd call it a limited series because it runs for a set number of episodes, and there's no question about whether it's going to be renewed or not because that's just the end of it. Um, but you never, I mean, every now and then something happens. I'm like, hey, that's kind of interesting.
Hmm.
And the idea not of continuing on in the future, but maybe setting it up a little bit, doing the prequel idea. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I toyed with that, and we're far enough. I'd hesitate to give away too much, but um, because I don't want to give away the end of the redemption of Allness. But the redemption of Allness, just the title tells you that something happened to Allness that needs to be redeemed. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that, of course, is that the city/city state was conquered and it needs to be freed. But a long time ago, I thought it would be really cool to write a story about the last night of Troy in the Trojan War. Just kind of take that one night from wheeling the horse into the city until the next morning when the Greeks are running rampant, the city's burning, and everything is horrible. Um, and then suddenly I'm like, what if I take that idea instead of writing the last night of Troy, I write the last night of Alness? That would actually be kind of cool. What led up to the fall of Alness? And that idea has sort of been percolating in my mind a little bit more and more. I have too many projects going on right now to say that I'm actually going to write it. But when you say, is this the end of it? I'm kind of like, yes, but maybe not. Maybe I'll find time to write this sort of prequel story to it.
Mm-hmm. I getcha. Uh, so when you do these books, you often have a Kickstarter associated with them. I've got the
Yep.
link in the description, but I'm going to put it in the chat. So why do you use the Kickstarter sort of method compared to other authors? I know men like Skylar Hernstrom tend to just sort of throw it out there, then maybe do a Kickstarter re-release later.
Yeah. So in some ways, that's a question for Alex at Kirstova because he's, the editor and all that sort of stuff. But from what I know about it, my understanding is that when you market through whether it's Ingram Spark or Kindle Direct Publishing or some other publishing house, and then it gets marketed through the Barnes and Noble. If you're publishing with Ingram Spark, then you can get it anywhere. So you go to your local bookstore and they can order it for you through the Ingram distribution network. That means, of course, that you need to be sharing your profits with everybody who puts their hands on the book,
Mm-hmm.
and that's fine. I mean, if Barnes and Noble sells the book, then Barnes and Noble is entitled to make some profit because they sold the book. But if we can sell the book without Barnes and Noble, then that's a little bit more money that stays with Kirsova Publishing. It's a little more money that goes into my pocket as the author. It allows us to do more things because the more money we make, the more illustrations you can put in it because we have illustrations by Dark Billy.
Mm-hmm.
There's when she was out for one of the episodes, another illustrator stepped in. There's the cover stuff. There's all sorts of stuff that you can do with more money. And if you do a Kickstarter to begin with, then you're doing direct sales to all the people who are buying, and you're not sharing that money with Amazon. You're not sharing that money with Barnes and Noble. They can have their cut later with later sales, but we can at least make a little extra money off the initial sales.
Mm. I understand. And it's a fantastic method that I do see a lot of people use these days. Though it's I don't know. It's just one of those things where I'm never quite sure how to interact with it because it's Kickstarter for a product that's already made. Like all these stories are written, or at
Yeah.
least yeah. And it's a product that we can have in our hand very soon. I think that's the benefit of this system. That it's guaranteed paid for, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, which is great because sometimes Kickstarters are like, I need the funding so that I can go out and make this thing.
Yep.
And they have, at the bottom of all the Kickstarter pages is that what are the risks involved with this? And some of them, this is speculative. If I can't make the thing or something like that, it could all fall apart. We don't have that problem. Alex doesn't have to say, well, if Jim doesn't write the stories, we don't have the book. I mean, the stories are already written. There's no
Yep.
risk in this whatsoever. I mean, his risk is not, can I make the thing? His risk is, do I suffer a heart attack before, publication? And that's not going to happen. So he has a great track record in getting these things not just out, but out on time, out early.
Oh yeah.
There's it seems to work pretty well. It gives us an opportunity to sort of extend a little bit further with things. So on this one, there's always other things to kind of entice buyers to add on stuff. And some of the original artwork that I just mentioned is available through the Kickstarter. So if there's a particular illustration that was in the magazine that you really like, or you just happen to see it and you say, I want the original art that Dark Billy drew and then submitted to Kursova so that it could be included in the magazine and the book, you can buy that. You can just add it on to your Kickstarter thing, and it'll be sent out to you, and you can have some original Mongoose and Meerkat artwork. It provides the opportunity for us to gauge the interest in other versions. So the first book, the Pursuit Without Asking, has a an audio version that you can buy. And the woman who did the reading did a fantastic job. I mean, she hit Kat's voice perfectly. There's an add-on story in there that she got the female lead character in that story perfectly as well. But those are really expensive and very time-consuming to make. Doing a Kickstarter for the Redemption of Allness as a stretch goal, one of the stretch goals is if we get to $6,000, then we'll do audio books for book 2 and book 3, and having that as part of the Kickstarter is a great way to gauge interest to see if people really want to and if it's actually worth doing that audio book.
Right. And yeah, that sounds pretty good. I always like to see audiobooks and such being made of my favorite series. Super Luminaries audiobook is absolutely fantastic. Um, the audiobook for Rachel Griffin's fantastic, and of course, I have while I haven't like read the whole thing, I thought what I heard of the audiobook also sounded very good. Um,
Yeah.
and well worth the investment if you enjoy these stories. Uh, yeah.
Yeah,
Let's.
and that's kind of that's a cool thing. I mean, like I started this with hopes but not expectations when you write a series of stories, which isn't
Mm,
exactly what's going on. I mean, it's not fish nor fowl because it's not a real novel because it's so episodic by design, but it's not completely independent stories. So what do you do with that? So every time one of these things happens, I'm like, this is so cool. I mean, an audiobook, this is so cool. And when they're auditioning people to read it and you get 5 different readers and you hear someone else reading your own words and you're like, wow, I can't believe I'm listening to somebody reading my work. This is
right.
wild. And the illustrations the same way. I mean, this is very flattering that this is popular enough that it's worth getting an illustration for that. And I mean, that the whole experience is really cool.
Mm, right. Uh, yeah. It is. I always like looking at these things and kind of living vicariously through it, just because it's just nice to look at. Let's just go over some of the rewards real quick with the Kickstarter. Uh, we have in the Kickstarter itself, if you purchase the book, ebook, hardback, or paperback, um, we have the Flying Mongoose story, Death and Renewal, Flight of the Sandfishers, Thunder in the North, Feast of the Fidai, uh, Trapped in the Loop, and the Redemption of Allness. Uh, I think usually I get the trade paperback uh, when I get these, and I'll be, of course, doing this for this as well. I am absolutely covered in your ebooks, by the way, tons of them. There's also a catch-up set for $50, where you get the 3 pocketbooks, volume 1, 2, 3, and a trade back one. Uh, there's a total format version for this one, which is all the formats. A hardcover catch up for $88, and then everything for 180. Though I'll admit, I've already got the other two. I'm perfectly fine with my.
Yeah.
Uh, I need them to look good on the shelf, Mr. Breyfogle. I just need them to look good on the shelf.
Yes, and if I can just sort of jump in real quick to add on that, no, if somebody wants to buy if somebody wants just one of this version and hasn't read the first two,
Mm-hmm.
every purchase comes with the e version of books 1 and 2. So if you wanted to catch up but you can't afford to spring for the entire hardcover set, you would get the e version of 1 and 2 with any purchase, even if it's just the ebook.
Mm.
So that's kind of a cheap and easy way. And obviously, I'm like, you need to have the whole set on the shelf, but I understand that people have limited budgets and maybe they're not in a position where they can buy 3 books right now, but you can get the whole set just by buying one. you'll have to have the first two in ebooks, but that's okay. You can still read them.
Mm. Uh, oh yes. Mm. Just looking through here.
Yeah. So the other thing that's included in these books, rather than just the format, and I'm sure this is probably where you were heading as you're looking through that, is in each of the previous books we've had an independent story, which is a non-Mongoose and Meerkat story. And the reason we do that is because these stories have been published in Kursova before.
Mm.
Um, and we'd kind of like to reward the people who have read them but nonetheless want the book with a story that they haven't read. So these additional stories have never been published in any format whatsoever, and we are doing that again with the redemption of allness. There's a story called Knots in the Thread of Time, which if you want to read it, it's only available in the book. And I have another book that'll be coming out at the end of this year called A Bad Case of Dead. And the first chapter of A Bad Case of Dead. Yeah, I mean, how do you catch dead? And once you got it, can you cure it? But the first chapter of A Bad Case of Dead will be in there. So you'll have all the Mongoose and Meerkat stories. You'll have Knots in the Thread of Time, and you'll have the first chapter of A Bad Case of Dead. The other thing it's an add-on, but we've already met the stretch goal, is we've had some role-playing content using the Mongoose and Meerkat as non-player characters for Dungeons and Dragons, and that will be included in this as well. So they're going to have leveled up. They're going to have new settings and some new things, so that if you play that and you want to use them as a character as NPCs, or you have been, that content will be included as well.
Nice.
And I think I mentioned the artwork is available if people are interested in original artwork that appeared in the magazine. We have the audio stretch goal. If we make it over $6,000, then we'll do audio versions of the books. And the last stretch goal, I don't remember exactly how much the number is trading cards of Mongoose and Cat, done by O'Shred, who would be a new illustrator who hasn't done any of those any Mongoose and Meerkat illustrations previously. I think that would be I want to say she'd be the fourth person who's illustrated it. So,
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. I like the illustrations and whatnot. I like the collection of them. Let's see. There's just a lot here, and I appreciate that. Like sometimes with the stuff, uh, like there's collaborations and such that they do, and then they seem to kind of just fall off the face of the earth and not interact with each other. Like it's just business, but then it's like, sure, but if this was successful or so successful that you work together for this, why not work for the next one too?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I like seeing repeat works. It really does sort of bring the community together.
Well, and it's been nice having, Dark Philly's done most of the illustrations for the magazines, and she's done a great job. And it's very interesting to see, how she interprets a scene. Because of course,
Hmm.
as the writer, I know what it looks like because it's in my head.
Right.
But then it becomes a question of how well do you communicate what's in your head onto the page.
Yep.
Um, and as you're doing that, of course, you can't go into every little detail because nobody wants to read that much description. So um, how effective are you in your choice of words and whatnot? So seeing what she has interpreted the scenes to be is fascinating. And there's one scene in particular. It's actually the cover of the second book, Heat of the Chase, is the same scene that she drew for the magazine, but from the opposite side of the room. So it's when Mangos and Cat have been they've been betrayed and they think they're getting their way out, but instead they open a gate, and I call it a kill gate demon comes through and is going to kill everybody in the room. Dark Philly illustrated it from the window looking over the shoulder of Mongoose and Cat into the room with the demon beyond them. And Anton Oxenuk, who did the cover illustration, did it from behind the demon. So you're looking past the demon toward the window where Mongoose and Cat are. And it's really very fascinating to me to see two different illustrators interpreting the same scene and how it compares to the way I originally thought of it when I was writing it.
Right, right. Yeah, I've had that experience myself working on Pinkerton's Ghost comic, which I need to get back on sooner than later, because I did pay for that one out of pocket to demonstrate our commitment to making stuff. You mentioned a few other short stories and other projects you're working on. Why don't you tell us about them?
Yeah, so the one that it's all wrapped up, Alex has the text and is going through copy editing right now. It's a bad case of dead. It starts off in London in 1835, I think is the exact year, which is not relevant. It just sets it, it gives you the time frame for when it starts. So late, early 19th century. And it's conceived as our world with a twist. So the wide world is the world that you know it. And all the things that are magical, all those folklore things like pixies and giants and vampires and zombies and things like
Mm-hmm.
that have essentially been eradicated. You hear stories of them because they used to exist, but they don't, not in any real sense anymore, except that they've been kind of driven out of our world into what I call the narrow world. And the narrow world is an archipelago that's kind of like half in our world and half in another world sort of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
there's still enough of an overlap that you can move back and forth between two. And our main character is a guy from Cornwall who went to London with intent to then go out into, somewhere in the empire to make his fortune, but he sort of gets hung up in London and never leaves until he comes across a remnant of this narrow world, which is a undescribed creature that attacks him, and it kills him. And I mean, it's the sort of creeping disease that it just scratches him and he doesn't even know what's happened, but he falls asleep, and when he wakes up he's dead. I mean, literally dead. His heart is no longer pumping. He doesn't breathe, but he's still basically functioning as a normal human being. And he's fortunate enough that he can find somebody who can describe what has happened to him. He is dead, and the prognosis for this is not good because the longer he stays dead, the more he becomes like you would associate as a zombie. He loses his coordination. He becomes stronger but clumsy. He loses the ability to think clearly. He gains an appetite for meat, particularly human flesh. Um, yeah, and it just goes downhill until he completely loses himself and has to be destroyed for everybody's everybody's benefit. But that leaves him a set period of time in which he can try and find a cure that nobody knows if it exists or not. But the only place that he can find this cure is to leave the wide world and travel to the narrow world and search throughout the archipelagos to try and find a cure. And the narrow world is where all these remnants of fantastic monsters and vampires and necromancers and dragons and all these other things. It's the last bastion for them on Earth. And it's among all the people who are there and the fantastical creatures and monsters that are there that he needs to search for the cure for dead. So that's the project that is done. My part of it is done except for the final, once it's been copy edited, then I'll get a copy and I'll double check them and have the last chance to make any changes.
Right, right.
And and there's that. The one that I'm writing right now, I call it the Summer Coast, but it's a three-part series. The first book is written. It's not the final. My final revisions are not done, but I want to get the entire story arc out before and by out I mean finished writing.
Hmm.
I want to get the whole thing finished before I start going back and looking at commas and things like that. The first book is The Summer Coast. The second book is Fools and Dragons. I'm probably about two-thirds of the way through that one. The third book is probably going to be The Last Dragon King. And it will have to do in a second world fantasy where obviously dragons do exist. But dragons have the ability to take human form. So you have a two-part society where you have dragons who are in human form. And that's not a metaphor. They truly are dragons. And they kind of run the show. And humans are very much subservient within the structures of the society. And that would be more along the lines of, say, the 1890s sort of thing. So a little bit of the Gilded Age with these fantastic mansions and things like that.
Right.
I've been working, yeah, I've been writing on it for a little while now, and I'm further along, but I still have a ways to go. So I'm not quite sure, when I'm going to wrap that one up.
Right. Well, I just had an amusing thought. It's like Alex Jones is right about the dragons. Uh, the conspiracy theory. There's a family of dragons ruling the world. How reactionary is this book, Jim Breyfogle? How reactionary?
It's none at all. None at
Oh,
all.
okay.
It has
I
absolutely
gotcha.
no intention to be tying into anything like that.
It's too late. It's just too late.
Yeah.
I'm already putting it in the annals. But just this
Yeah.
library opens up into, a recreation of the German mid 1940s hall. It's like just slide in the book someday.
Yeah.
No, no, no. There's a lot of hullabaloo over not much of anything, and I do appreciate the focus on craft on a lot of these things. It would be very easy to gain some internet clout, such as it is, to do something like focus on the Harry Potter thing, or any number of other supposed scandals, which are honestly just nothing, or somebody who couldn't stop being horny on main chat, um, which is
Yeah.
an eternal problem. But it's I just to kind of appreciate that. It's we don't need that for everything. Uh,
No.
oh,
And if really if you want your stuff, I mean, and this isn't, I mean, there's a place for everything.
yes.
And I'm not the person who wants to chase after contemporary commentary.
Yep.
Um, and it's I was actually, earlier today as I'm writing, I'm a phrase runs through my mind, and I have to stop because I'm like, that's a very contemporary phrase.
Yep.
And if I use that, it'll work for 2 years,
Yep.
and then it'll start sounding dated. And if I want my stories to be appreciated and relevant and read in 10 or 20, and this is probably just ego or blind hope that somebody in 30 years might read my story and say, hey, that's actually pretty good, then I probably shouldn't get trapped in idiom or political commentary or things like that. I mean, even something like Disney's Aladdin.
Yes.
Robin Williams did a fantastic job, but when he goes reeling through all those genie personas, how many people now, are going to recognize Arsenio Hall?
I didn't
Of
recognize
a
Arsenio Hall.
Yeah, people of a certain age might, but after that age group is gone, that's not going to have any relevance whatsoever. And I don't want to be one of those people who does that. So I'm
Mm,
like, okay, if this is what I want to say, this turn of phrase will work and everybody will get it, but in 10 years they won't. So I need to figure out a way that I can, make it sound in the tone of the book so that it still works and the dialogue still pops, but um, I'm not making it sound like 2023 when in 15 years it won't be 2023. And I don't want to bang on Heinlein because he wrote great stuff. But if you read some of his stuff, it's, what year is it? 2021 or sorry, 2100 or something. And it still sounds like 1950.
yeah,
Um, so the stories are still good, but the dialogue is very dated. And
yeah.
yeah, if you chase your political commentary or something like that, then you run the risk of doing that as well.
Oh yeah, because it's like I've read some esoteric stuff in the past, and it's like Western civilization started falling with the Guelph and Ghibelline crisis. The what? And like and all it was is the Byzantines had it's complicated, but essentially the Normans invaded. There was some religious struggles and some struggles over the land between the Byzantines and everyone else who was fighting over Sicily, and everyone was fighting over Sicily, and they used some money and got some people murdered uh, on a holy day, and that's the whole thing, and it's like this weird political thing that like people will study, and it's absolutely fascinating. People were getting uh, torn apart left and right, mostly literally, but at the same time it's like reading this guy who was writing in the 1950s or whatever, whose defense in court after World War II was he's so right wing, no one else can touch him, and always wore a monocle, and was everything you can imagine some stuffed shirt to be like. But then it's like, yeah, yeah, we've been declining as a civilization since 1248 or whatever it was. No,
Yeah,
I I don't think so. Uh,
yeah.
and it's the same way with literature. We've been in decline since the popes. No, you know, no, like
Well, and I try and avoid a lot of political and social commentary about some of this stuff because, as I stated earlier on, I'm not trying. That's not the purpose of Mongoose and Meerkat. The
oh
purpose
yeah,
of Mongoose and Meerkat is to write fun stories that people will enjoy reading. It's not to rile people up. It's not to make them angry or anything like that. Um,
but I want to be riled
and
up.
well, there's certainly enough things to rile people up, but that wasn't my intent as I was
Mm,
writing these things. I mean, I was sitting down and I was looking back at um, some of the precursors, the stories from the 50s and 60s that did the adventuring, the sword and sorcery adventuring trope. Seeing how they did it, seeing how we had changed since then, because people, you know, some people call it evolution, some people call it declination. I mean, are we going up? Are we going down? Or are we just changing? But we've definitely changed since the 50s.
yeah,
So I wanted to, and like I was saying about the stories themselves, can you do dragons in a way everybody loves dragons, but can you do them differently? Can you take these things from the 50s and can you do them differently in a way that is better for today so that you're not stuck in 50s dialogue, maybe you're not stuck in 50s attitudes, whatever it is you need to do to sort of make it a little bit more relatable.
mm,
um, that's what I was trying to do. I wasn't really trying to get on anybody's blast or anything like that
yeah,
with political commentary, and I've kind of gone on record several times saying I don't want to be involved in the Mongoose and Meerkat is not part of the culture wars, and I don't want it to be.
right, right. Clearly the attitude of a Gelf and not a Gibelline like ourselves. Uh,
Yeah.
but the yeah. So to sort of like get on that a bit more. So what do you do to keep from like falling into the pit of sounding like a 1930s Howard ripoff?
Um, that's a good question. So some of the stuff, yeah, I mean, I trying to organize my thoughts in a way because when I write a book, um, I've I don't think I'm going to sit down with the exception of the Mongoose America. So when I'm talking about the Summer Dragons, that's inspired by something that it was actually a real world inspiration,
Hmm.
and the storyline doesn't come from anything that I've read per se.
Right.
Um, and so I'm writing the stories that speak to me, and sometimes I do see things that I'm like, oh, you know, if you wanted to squint and look hard, that could be sort of similar to something that I read 30 years ago. But as I'm writing it, I'm not thinking about that, and I'm not
Right.
doing, and I'm not trying to mimic it. I made a friend recently who is a writer, and he was telling me what his book was about, and we got 3 minutes into his description. I'm like, oh, so like Terry Brooks, and he's like, oh my God, Terry Brooks is my favorite author. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, I kind of got that impression.
Right.
But I try and read very broadly so that I don't fall into the cadence or the tone or somebody else's patterns. So when I come to the table to tell my own story, I'm not coming from one particular author that I read all the time and nothing else,
Right.
so that I can be cross-pollinated. Sounds kind of goofy, but you know what I mean when I say that. I can
Hmm.
have all sorts of different influences and backgrounds. And I have a really, really weird library of books, everything from probably the best collection of Penguin classics outside of the library. If you
Nice.
want Suetonius, I have, all of Suetonius. Um, all the way up to Terry Brooks and beach reading fantasy and all sorts of steampunk and all sorts of
Hmm.
things. So hopefully by doing that, it will help me tell the stories I come up with, which are not Howard's stories, in a way that is my way of telling it, that is not Howard's way of telling it.
Right. And that's a good answer. While people like to say, "Oh, well, you have to have that elevator pitch where you say, oh, fans of X, it's like this, and it's like X and Y and such," and it's like, sure, but like there's always another layer to it. Like even though we want to have a certain amount of mass market appeal, um, you know, the mass market's going to change in 5 minutes. And, to be fair, if you write to the mass market, you're always going to be late to the mass market.
Right.
Um,
And I tried. So when you say how do you not sound like something else, when I actually worked for Barnes and Noble for a few years.
nice.
In their receiving department, I was, opening all the books and getting them ready to be shelved and all that sort of stuff. And of course, as an aspiring writer, you're looking to see what people want, and all the editors are saying, we want something new and groundbreaking that has never been done before that will just, like take our breath away and blow our socks off all at once. And we can't even tell you what we want because you haven't discovered it. There's nothing like it out there. And then, as a receiving manager, I'm watching the same old stories just with a new cover come out of each and every box. And I'm like, you say you want something new, but you're publishing the same old crap again and again and again. It just has a different author and a different cover. So
Yep.
I just started to write the same old story. I'm like, okay, it needs to be Tolkien-esque, and that you have a big bad guy threatening the world, and there is an artifact of some sort that you need to go find and then take it to the big bad guy and like poke him with it so that he'll disappear. And you need the classic underdog, and then you need a group of heroes to help them through, and then they need to have adventures with long quests. And I started to write this story, and every time I hit a problem, I'd be like, okay, since I'm not actually coming up with this story, all I need to do is ask myself, what would Tolkien do in this? And then I can write that sort of thing into the story, because obviously I was a little bit cynical at the time,
Mm.
and I couldn't do it. I got like three-quarters of the way through this Lord of the Rings Terry Brooks. I'll just stop because I don't want to offend anybody else who's written stories of a similar vein, but there are, as you know, a lot of them.
Yep.
Um, and and it was just I couldn't do it. I'm like, this is there's the story itself is just so horribly derivative. I can't stick with it. The funny thing was, though, the episodes were pretty good. And it was one of those episodes within this overall story, that epic fantasy trilogy idea that was not original, but one scene of that is in the Redemption of Allness under the title Knots in the Thread of Time. So this is an episode within a story arc, excuse me, a story arc that everybody would recognize a story arc. They'd be like, oh, this is the quest to grab the artifact so that you can fight the bad guy, but you've never seen it told like this before.
Right. And it's one of those things, the joke is like, are you following me? We have some people doing, oh no, you lost me the second, you started ripping off Tolkien. Except without the deep poetry, without the specialness that makes Tolkien Tolkien, because it wasn't
Right.
the many different little things that people think about it, like the quest and the hobbits and everything like that. It was the full package. Tolkien has an incredibly strong authorial voice that comes through in every page, even if it's several chapters of guys running through the valleys of Rohan. Oh boy, more chasing down the hobbits. I always skip those chapters, but it's
Yeah.
it's it's like there's no point in mimicking the master, because you only can go so far mimicking the master.
Right.
Um,
And
nope.
Tolkien's not one of those guys that, I mean, sometimes you get something where they do something absolutely new and different, but they don't do it really well. So you're like, oh my
Yeah,
God, nobody's ever done werewolves before. And there's this whole range of things that you can improve upon. Tolkien was so good in so many things
yeah,
that it's so hard to improve on him.
yep.
And and so, I mean, I was recently talking with somebody, and we were talking about Tolkien, and I'm like, yeah, I've never created my own language. I mean, I
Right.
barely know enough linguistics that if I want to, like create a coherent place name, people group, then I know that you need to put certain letter groups together continuously in certain ways to make it sound like they have root, words for their language. But that's the most I've ever done. I've never actually gone out and made my own language. And of Tolkien, I'm kind of weird because I like almost all of Tolkien's writings.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm not so much on his academic stuff, of course, and not so much on the stuff that was incomplete tales. I mean, there's a reason that they were incomplete, so I don't consider them to be canon or anything. But I like the Silmarillion.
Yeah,
And one of the reasons I like the Silmarillion is because it shows just how much care and detail Tolkien put into his world building. I mean, that's just a phenomenon. That's like an entire history book of a world that never existed, and it's really tight. I mean, you don't
yeah,
find too many things that disagree with each other. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing.
yeah. And it is amazing. He deserves the praise he gets. But most people aren't going to be able to hit that in any way, shape, or form. And almost, like there's enough to aim at for ourselves and in our careers as writers that it's almost better not to imitate. Like
Right.
a lot of people in our circles love the Nightlands. I love the Nightlands. The atmospheric horror, the threat, the brooding menace is just there, and it's always there. And then the author spends, many pages flirting with the woman who is certainly not an insert of his wife. Certainly not.
No,
No,
no, never. That
no,
never happens.
right.
And if And if she's not, he's in trouble with his wife.
Right, exactly. Uh, and I'm poking fun at but it's the brooding menace is oftentimes undercut with smooches, but I think it has an important lesson there. It's about the love overcoming the horror, but I think that as things go, people have both lost the ability to describe love, which I've seen much more in older works than newer works, and also an inability to properly describe horror. Um, I think when you're self-satisfied and self-smart about a lot of things, you lose the ability to be scared of the unknown.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Oh, and it's a lot harder these days. And maybe I'm not a huge horror person, so I don't lean into it as much as other people, but it feels like it's a lot harder in today's very cynical world where we have things. I mean, I keep I mean, I have kids and they're grown now and they're tired of hearing it, but I show them a smartphone. It's you know nothing special. It's just you know a fairly new, but not the newest version. I'm like, this is science fiction. And they look at me and
Yeah.
I'm like, no, seriously, this is literally science fiction. I mean, your Apple Watch is that Dick Tracy watch from the late 50s. And this was inconceivable. I mean, some friends and I wrote out a game when I was in high school that it was, for all intents and purposes, it was Warcraft.
Yeah.
And you had different countries, you had different armed forces. It wasn't orcs and elves, but it was like Warcraft in a World War II setting, and it was great for like the first 5 rounds. But having a physical dungeon master where you're handing papers back and forth and they're comparing maps and saying, okay, your scout ship can see this for like 6 different people, it was just so unwieldy that you couldn't play it. And we were
Yeah.
like, man, wouldn't it be great if we had a machine that could do this for us?
Right.
And we're what, 20 years past that? 30
Yep.
years past that? I mean, it literally is science fiction, but all those things that felt impossible before are no longer impossible, but they're easily explained. Or if they can't be explained, we have a confidence that we can explain them. So that portion of horror, that there is something completely unexplainable that can do horrible things to you, is harder to sell people because it's harder for people to say, well, we can explain that. Or if we can't explain it, I'm sure there is an explanation. So that sort of creeping feeling, I think, is harder to invoke.
I agree. Uh, yeah. I do like the new AI stuff, especially since people are like, "Oh yeah, the uncanny valley is a thing." I give it about
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, the first time I wasn't aware that it was quite as far along as it was until just recently. But did you see the art show late last year where an AI generated painting won the award? And there was a
yeah,
big discussion. Yeah, and there's a discussion, is this really art or not, when you just tell a computer to, this is, I want a picture of this, and the computer gives it to you. And I was all set to, they were like, whoa, we'll take beta testers, and I was all set to do it, but they wanted more information from their beta testers than I was willing to give them. So I'm
yeah.
like, hey, I'll sit this one out. I'm not willing to give you all this personal information just so you can test your program.
Oh yeah. And it's that kind of thing is I'm not entirely convinced it's not in any way inhabited by demons or anything like that. So it's
There you
you're probably making the right call. Um, uh, I think we'll see more interesting things as time goes on. But one thing is for sure, especially as an editor, I am definitely paying attention to the quirks of Chat GPT. Just oh my goodness, like I am like not in fear of it, but like I don't want to have to edit machine scripts. Uh,
go.
it's like give me a Conan the Barbarian story, and it'll just give you a Conan the
And
Barbarian
it does.
story. And now, fortunately, there are some things that we can recognize. The machine is either overly complex with its sentence structure or not varied with its sentence structure. Like, it's perfectly grammatically correct, but it's like a paragraph for one sentence.
Hmm.
When a three short sentences would do better. That sort of thing. Like there are
Right.
markers where we may understand whether or not we are dealing with flesh and blood,
Right.
or the fake mockery of human existence.
Well,
But
I don't know as much about it, but I mean, I do know that short sentences carry action and long sentences carry emotion, and if the machine doesn't know that, it's going to have some problems.
yep. Uh, don't go ahead.
So,
Hmm?
yeah, so I wanted to mention I've told this to Ben a few times, but whenever the subject of ChatGPT shows up, I don't. You might know this. Ben's not as big of a fan of the author as I am, but Roald Dahl wrote a
Yeah.
short story. Are
Hmm.
you aware of the story I'm talking about by any chance?
I probably not.
It's
I've read several of his stuff, but not many of his short stories.
So his short story, he was known as the Edgar Allan Poe of Europe. So he was
Hmm.
actually like a horror story writer. His most famous is Lamb to the Slaughter, which was turned into an episode of the Alfred Hitchcock show, I believe, about a
Okay.
woman who murders her husband with a frozen leg of mutton, then feeds it to the police. Good story. But
Yeah.
this story, which is one of his best, was known as the Great Automatic Grammatizator, and it is very darkly funny. Essentially, a like young promising intern at a publishing company invents a machine that can write stories for you called the Great Automatic Grammatizator, that you put in like how much intrigue and mystery and passion even, and then you put in a length, and it'll spit out either a story and eventually a novel. And over the course of his story, the stories that the Great Automatic Grammatizator can create become so realistic that he says they're not better than every author, but they're better than probably, I forget the number he used, like at least 50% or something of the authors on the market. And then authors start using it and start signing their names over to the company so that the stories that are coming out are not actually written by them, but are written by the Great Automatic Grammatizator imitating them.
Right.
So I think they say eventually like 90% of the market is made up of just the grammatizator. And then finally, it ends with the narrator of the unnamed narrator of the story says his hand keeps inching over to the contract because he has his 9 screaming children in the other room who need food, and he's not selling anything, but if he signs his name over to the contract, he'll be able to feed them. And his
Yep.
hand keeps inching a little closer every day. Great story. The ChatGPT stuff does remind me of that very
Yeah.
vividly. Here is the thing with Ben's optimism right now, and I get why, like, he's correct about it as is, but 100%, and don't think that this won't happen. There will come a time very, very soon, like within a year or two, that we will not be able to tell. You'll
Yes.
think you will. You'll be confident that you will, but you won't.
Yeah. I don't disagree. Because one is partly because there's such a wide range of what humans write. I mean, I'm sure that there's people out there writing stories that we would think were written by a machine programmed in the 80s. They're so bad. Um, so having a really advanced program being able to write better than many humans do, I think is very plausible. I wouldn't at all be surprised. I mean, some of these beach reading things, I mean, I'm not involved in writing romance, thank God, but I've been told that there is literally a formula, a script for some of the romance publishing houses that they give to their authors and say the stories need to follow this format. And if that's what you're doing, there's no reason a machine couldn't do that for you.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and it seems to me that you will probably have a certain level which would continually rise as the machines got better and better. But if you wanted that leap of inspiration, that the truly great literature that just, breaks new barriers and goes in original directions, that may still need a human to do that. That's what I'd like to
Well,
think
yes.
is that it will still need to. I mean, the machine can the machine can take it right up to where you are now, but the leaps of inspiration, I don't know how you could program that in.
Yep.
So you're absolutely correct about that, which was the point of the grammatizator story. He is very specific in his story. It doesn't get rid of all humans, but like the very top humans are going to survive, but only them. The other thing too is like it's amazing what it's already done. Like for example, the college essay is now dead. It's dead. Like you don't need to write an essay anymore. Just factually, I've seen it. I've tested it. I am 100% convinced it would convince a college professor. Like, and not even like you might go, oh, well, that speaks badly of college professors. I don't even think it does. Like, they're not bad essays. You
Right.
know. The other thing too is that I once did as a test. I literally went through and picked a random word. I forget. I think I went on a website called Random Word Generator. The word was scrap, SCRAP, and I write a Shakespearean sonnet on scrap. Hit enter. It came out with a sonnet. I could not have written that. Like I could not. It was a better poem than I would have been able to write. So it made sense. It had some nice turns of phrase in there. You know, you might want to reword a couple sections maybe, but like overall, like I would have felt confident submitting that to like a poetry anthology and claiming it as my work. Now I'm not going to do that, but you know, I think I
But
could
somebody would.
it in right Ben in the Superversive. Oh yeah, somebody will. It's going to be a scandal when it happens because then they're going to come out and they're going to admit that they did it, and it's going to make the news.
Well, and I could,
shock people.
I could see some hybrid work too, where somebody might be saying, "Yeah, I want to write some, Tolkien-esque work," and now's the point where I need to have the elves singing their songs in Elvish, but I'm not up for it, so I'm going to use the AI to fill in that part.
Yep.
I could see somebody doing that.
Yep.
Yeah, see, that's the sort of thing I think it could actually be genuinely useful for, like improving art. You know what I mean? Like, I don't consider, there is a point where, number one, like the ethical question is interesting because then you go, okay, but if we know, let's say that the person who does it admits it was an AI, then should I be reading this? Why or why not? Right? Like, I mean, they're not lying. It's an AI, but it's good,
Yeah.
So,
well,
what's the problem?
Right. And if what you're looking for is an experience which is, enjoyable reading, then yeah, your point is well taken. Do you care who wrote it? Or do you just care that it is a story that gives you pleasure when you read it? And some of it might be, I mean, I can't believe, so this illustration that was done by a computer, my understanding is that you still have to direct it. I want an illustration which shows, two lovers reuniting in front of a waterfall, and then it gives you that. But if that's not good enough, then you need to refine what it's like. No, I want a waterfall with trees around it, reflecting pool at the bottom and fish swimming or something like that. At some point, there is still a human input as you're directing the AI to create what you want. And I don't know how creative that needs to be. I mean, maybe you get lucky and it gives you exactly what you want the first time, but maybe there's some skill in how you direct the AI. I don't know.
Yeah, there definitely does need to be like, some level of skill in the direction of the AI. Like you got to be more and more specific in what you're asking for and direct it in a certain way. But the fact of the matter is, it's like there are things that the AI will be able to do better than I can without it. So at what point is it? Where is it human and where is it an AI? They're interesting questions, and I'm wondering, like again, if as long as you are honest about it, like if you're going, well, this is what it is. Like you mentioned before, does it matter who wrote it? Like here's a really interesting conversation I once witnessed. I think it was on the National Novel Writing Month forums in many moons ago. This would have been years and years ago. I witnessed this conversation. Somebody was talking about like their favorite novels, and they mentioned Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. So somebody asked them, And they like genuinely just asked it, at least from my perspective. Maybe they were trying to provoke them, but it didn't look like it to me. They said, "Does it bother you to know, if you realize that Emily Bronte probably did not write Wuthering Heights like the majority of, I don't know, by the way, if this is accurate or not. I've never done any research. I haven't read Wuthering Heights. It's not a story that particularly interests me. I'm sure it's good. Yeah. Like at this point, I think we could say, yeah, Wuthering Heights is a good book. But, I have no skin in this game, is what I'm saying. Like, there's no dog in this fight. She's going, like, does it bother you that Emily Bronte probably was not really the author of Wuthering Heights? That it was severely edited to the point where it was unrecognizable from the original, that her input was relatively limited in the grand scheme of things, like, and the person who responded to her, like, got offended and said, like, you don't know that, or whatever, and then the person goes, all right, I take that to mean that you do care. Yeah, like, it is something that bothers you, not, you want Emily Bronte to be the author of this. So that'll become an interesting question too. A book comes out, you're really moved by it, you love it, it's by a certain author, and then you learn that, probably more than half of it was like really the result of the AI, right?
Right.
How does that affect your enjoyment of it? Does it? Maybe should it? Like,
Right.
they're interesting ethical questions.
And those are probably questions that are best left to an individual, because somebody may not care, but somebody might feel absolutely betrayed that that's what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
That's my thought.
Yep.
I don't have an answer to this, right? Like, I don't know if there is an answer that's even possible to give. But I do think that the question is very interesting.
Yes. Yes. And I suspect that at some point that very question will be worked into the curriculum of, English literature majors and things like that. Because, yeah, I mean, if you can have an AI generated book that either becomes financially successful or literarily successful or both, then you're going to have to start having questions on what it means to generate literature and if it's truly a human experience.
Yeah, and again, like, I think the Wuthering Heights story, it's kind of reveals, like, there's nothing new under the sun. This whole issue of it takes a new skin with AI being added into the equation, but it's not as if this is the first time humans have ever dealt with the general concepts behind this whole issue. Like,
Right.
there's the whole, I mean, who wrote the Shakespeare plays, or there was a crazy story from a relatively recently, like, this dropped. I want to say within 5 years. The Iceland. Have you heard the story of the Icelandic Dracula?
No, I don't think I have.
So it's an interesting story. Myrna, I think it's called. The story that dropped, and by the way, I then heard it like revised, and people were saying like, "Oh, it was exaggerated. It wasn't as extreme as it was originally stated." But this is the original version of it that I heard that I found very amusing. So, apparently, in Iceland, I want to say again, this is off of my memory. So, but Dracula, the translation that they have of Dracula, has been for the entire existence of Dracula's translation, like since, the early 1900s, late 1800s, whatever, has been completely different than the English language Dracula. So apparently, the translator took it upon himself to say that he did not really like the version that he got, the English finished Dracula, so rewrote it where there is a lot less England and a lot more Transylvania, and Dracula has a more prominent role in the story. It's a lot more like romantic and a lot more I mean, I want to say sexual, but I don't mean to imply like pornographic sexual.
Right.
I mean, but a lot more sexually charged, maybe.
Right.
Is the word that you would use. Basically, how Dracula has been reinterpreted by the media, and all of the things of the Dracula mythos that have like survived and people actually care about. This guy, the translator of the Icelandic Dracula, kind of rewrote into the version that Iceland got. And they said, here's the craziest part of all. this was again in the original version of the story I heard. I've then heard since that it was like exaggerated, but
Mhm.
supposedly he did this based on notes from Bram Stoker. That Bram
Hmm.
Stoker sent the translator notes over what Dracula was like, what was supposed to be emphasized in the story. So he was not just making these changes because he wanted to make the changes. He was going off of the original notes that Bram Stoker wrote. So they
Right.
said the theory here is that the version of Dracula that was translated into Icelandic is more similar to the original version of the story of Dracula than the original published version that was put out in English. Now,
Right.
is this actually true? I've heard differing things since then. People have like said slow your jets on this, like, it's not nearly as exaggerated as
Right.
people are saying.
Right. The changes may not be quite as large or something like that. No, that's interesting. I was not familiar with that. And
But
yeah.
there are some parallels here to the story of like, okay, so now that you've learned about Mictmyrna, the Icelandic Dracula, like, does that change what you think of the story? And then you go, huh. And then which one is closer to Dracula as Bram Stoker intended it as well? Because I will say this, it is true that like Dracula is in that category of books along with like I would put Frankenstein in there as well that I almost consider like beyond criticism where you go like are there things that I would do better or they're like or that I would do differently or better and they're not perfect books but they have clearly done something that's left such an impact on people and has like put such an indelible mark on like the literary landscape and society that whatever I think of them, like it doesn't really matter at this point. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
and
I,
go
yeah,
ahead.
obviously a lot of those the classic books of fiction are, head and shoulders above. You can say what you might like or dislike, but they're above us petty mortals now really can't approach them. But in some ways, I mean, what you just described, except for the fact, I mean, if it were true that he got Bram Stoker's notes and went by that, which might make it closer to what Stoker wanted before the editor got his hands on it. I mean, fan fiction has been around for a long time. And if you want to look at kind of
Yep.
classic literature that just gets inundated with fan fiction, look no further than Sherlock Holmes. I mean, and just because somebody takes the characters and writes their own stories for it doesn't necessarily make it authentic. But what you're describing isn't exactly that. It's not that, but it's not that. It's somewhere in between.
Yeah, exactly. That's what makes I've always found that story very, very fascinating. And I don't get me wrong, I would tend to think like there's a little bit too much Hollywood in the telling. I think, like it's too fun almost. So I would
Mm,
tend to think that the Icelandic version of it, like maybe it's, I've heard people go like, and it's better than the version Bram Stoker made, and it's like, well, is it really though?
yeah.
And then I've heard people
Well,
dispute
and
it, but it's a fun story.
it's a fun story, and there's always somebody who's, they got to be the smartest person in the room. So no matter how good something is, they're going to find something wrong with it. So they're going to be like, "Oh, I like this better than that because I'm different and more enlightened." But I mean, Bram Stoker. Have you ever read the what is the Jewel of the Seven Stars?
No.
I have
So
not.
it's kind of a weird book, and nothing happens. But it's so well told. I mean, you get to the end of it, and you're waiting for something to happen, and then smoke fills the room, and nobody knows anything. And then when it clears, you don't know if anything happened or what happened or anything like that. And you're just like, really, really, you're not going to let us know? And then if you step back, you realize that he had you on the edge of your seat and you were just right there waiting and so interested. And it's like he set this hook so well for something that never happened. And I'm like, wow, if I could just set the hook that well, that'd be great. I wish I could do that.
Yeah, I
So
mean, part of like, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no,
Finish
I
your
was just
thought.
going to bring that back to, so there's definitely something in his ability to write a story. And there's a reason why Dracula has attained the stature that it has. It's not just that, oh, it's a cool vampire story and people like vampires. He brought more than just that to the book.
Yep.
Yep, I would agree. Yeah, it's. I'm trying to think of how to put it exactly. Like, here's a fun thing. So I've read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I greatly
Mm-hmm.
enjoyed. I enjoyed it. It's completely different than the Hollywood versions that have come out later, as many people have noted. Is it better though? Is the other question, and I'm not so sure about that. But that's one of the things where I would go like, but also, what does it really matter what I think at this point? Like, the fact is, those other versions would not exist without Mary Shelley's original. You
Right.
know, like if she hadn't written her version, and I also would think that it is far from a poor book. You know, that would be, I would consider that to be just an incorrect, right? Like for
Sure.
objective reasons, you know, this is a well structured, well written book. Uh, yeah, it's interesting because I've been watching just a blogger who is like, you know, very small blogger, but he's been reading classic works like Dante's Inferno, Shakespeare,
Mm-hmm.
and writing his reviews of them. And I put on there, like, it was an interesting discussion, honestly, because I said I find it amusing that you put after Dante's Inferno, like, I recommend this. Like, I think we're past that. You know, I think that Dante's Inferno is recommended. You know,
Right.
Yeah.
whatever. Uh, but he made the argument. He's like, I get your point, but at the same time, like, I think we should kind of try and judge. Like, okay, but is it entertaining? Is it something you actually want to read? You know,
And
and I
and
sort of get that.
and what do you expect to get out of it too, though? I mean, because some of the stuff it's undeniably great literature, and it could, you know, I don't want to say enlighten us if we let it. Although that's kind of what I'm saying is because we can take a lot of stuff away from great literature, but some of it you have to be in the right space for. I mean, go to any high school class that's reading Shakespeare, and those kids just can't understand a word of it. You basically have to immerse yourself in Shakespeare long enough so that you can get the cadence and the idiom and the way that
Yeah,
he's his dialogue goes. As soon as you can, as soon as you can understand the, the verbiage of Shakespeare, then you can start to understand the story of Shakespeare. But you got to read enough of it to get the first one before you can get to the second one. And it's not just Shakespeare because of the Shakespearean English, but it's the way writing changes over time. Because if you read Moby Dick, oh my God, Moby Dick is 80% of it is unreadable. And the other 20% is exciting and great and cool, but oh, holy crap,
yep,
when he's talking about the anatomy of the whale or the structure of the whaling ship, you're just like, would you recommend Moby Dick? I'm like, I don't know. Would I recommend Moby Dick? It's above my recommendations because clearly we know that Melville is a great writer and he had some fantastic things to say, but would I actually recommend it? I don't know. So maybe it is a relevant question to say, yeah,
yeah,
I
you're
think you should.
absolutely right. The thing about Shakespeare, like, it's fascinating what you said because I remember I was reading Shakespeare. This is a memory I always have, and I've been in Shakespeare shows. I've watched Shakespeare shows, right? And we were reading Othello as a class. This is my senior year of high school. I was in like the advanced English class, you know, whatever. Doesn't matter. But we were reading it as a class, and we had a recording going of Othello. And I vividly remember that there was just a class period where listening to Othello, it's putting you to sleep with the lilt, right? And you're trying not to fall asleep, and it looks. And there was a moment where, like, I had been listening to it enough that something clicked in my head, and suddenly I understood what was being said in
Mm-hmm.
Shakespeare, and you sort of, because you listen to it enough and you read enough, you start kind of automatically translating it in your head, and suddenly I'm like, this is really good. You know,
Yeah,
it's like I
yeah.
get it now.
And suddenly the Merry Wives of Windsor is funny, and some of the snide asides is I think it's Hamlet, where he's talking about maybe you'll find the body if you smell underneath the stairs. And suddenly, when you're in that rhythm, you're like, oh, wow, that's funny. And you're reading it in class, and like two people laugh. And you're like, okay,
Yeah,
two people out of 35 got that joke. It's probably because the other people just weren't, their heads weren't right for picking it up.
yeah, exactly. And it's just a matter of my experience with Shakespeare is that it's a matter of you really like there's no shortcut to it. You need to put the time in to understand Shakespeare. Like you need to
Yep.
sit and you need to get used to the language. But once you do, it's like, Shakespeare is very rewarding.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you can't there's no shortcuts.
And it's one of those things, until you do that, everybody says Shakespeare is just fantastic. Until you do that, you can read Shakespeare and you're just like, oh my God, I don't understand why people think that he's so good. I keep hearing that
Right.
and then suddenly the light goes on and you're like, I get it now. There's an analogy for Mozart. Everybody says Mozart is a great composer. He's a great composer. He's a great composer, but they never tell you why he's a great composer. Um,
Yep.
and I went to it was an ancient music concert, and they talked about a piece that he had written, and they said this would have been played in a setting where it was a large party, and the party broke out into three different parts. And if you had three wings of the hall, on one wing, you would have people doing folk dancing, and it would sound like this. In another wing, you would have the middle class, and they would be doing this popular dance, and it would sound like this. And in the third wing, you would have the upper class, and they would be doing a waltz, and it would sound like this. But if you stood in the center of the hall, where you could hear all three of them at once, it would sound like this. And you had three very different sounding pieces of music, but they all worked together. So when you heard them all at once, it was one coherent piece. And suddenly I'm like, oh my God, now I understand why Mozart was a great composer, because he could take three very distinct styles and make them one piece. And Shakespeare's kind of the same way, is you don't understand why he's great until you have that epiphany that say, suddenly I get it now. People don't tell me why he's great, but suddenly I've gotten enough immersion in him that I can understand what he's saying, and now I realize why he's great.
Yeah, I had that experience with Beethoven where I was trying to, it was one of those things where like I was trying to be like, I'm gonna listen to classical music if it kills me and figure out,
And it
what
might.
music is good and how to enjoy it.
Yep.
Right? And I was listening to the Ninth Symphony and like going, like, okay, it's fine. And then I looked it up. Somebody created a guide to like the Ninth Symphony, like what's going on in it, piece by piece. And listening to the Ninth Symphony, I can't remember what it was, or I would link it. Listening to the Ninth Symphony with this guide, which wasn't a long guide, just like a page long, going through like this is what they're doing in the first symphony, this is what they're doing in the second, is fascinating. Like all of a sudden, I'm like, oh wow, this is like what he's doing here is amazing.
Yeah.
Like I recall hearing like the Ninth Symphony, the final section of the Ninth Symphony, the famous one which has the Ode to Joy in it.
Mm-hmm.
They're saying like, okay, so listen to the beginning of the symphony. They said, notice what he's doing. He starts with the first, it's like the symphony is broken into 5 sections, and it's like he starts playing the first section and then he stops, and then the second section, and then he stops, and he keeps going, playing little bits of it, and it's almost as if Beethoven is saying, like, no, this isn't right. No, this isn't right. We need to do something different. And then the Ninth Symphony, of course, was like the fifth section of the Ninth Symphony. Supposedly at the time was like this absolutely rad thing, to the point where people gave him a standing ovation for the second section of the Ninth Symphony. But in the final section of the Ninth Symphony, everybody was very confused because they didn't understand it, and that became the section he became most famous for, because he
Yeah.
brings in a singer. It's a choral symphony, which is very rare, which was very, very rare at the time. He didn't originate it, but it was not common at all. And he's just doing these radically different things in this section. And I didn't know any of that. Like, I did not understand any of this until I read this guide. And once I read it, though, once I knew what was going on, I'm like, wow, this is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Like it's just so interesting to see what he was doing. And it also makes you feel a little better that even these people are like, even the people who originally heard it were like, I don't get it.
Yeah. Yeah. No
So
doubt. Well, it, so I've been writing on this Fools and Dragons portion, and everybody has beta readers that help them out, and and it's a tremendous compliment when one of my beta readers is like, "This is an effortless read. I can just read it and it just flows so smoothly." And I'm like, "You have no idea how hard it is to make something an effortless read." And that's kind of, like Mozart. If you listen to Mozart, it's great, but from not being a music expert, I don't know why it's great. I just know that it's a tune that I like to listen to. And now, once you sit down and you realize and you see the craftsmanship, not everybody does. I mean, I could listen to an opera and I would not know why an opera is good because I just don't know what goes into making an opera or a lot of this music composition. Why is this song good and this song isn't? But we do sort of recognize in some fundamental way what makes the song good because those are the ones that last. I mean, and those are the books that last. Great books have quality to them, even if we don't know why Dostoevsky is good, we recognize that Dostoevsky is good.
yeah,
Yep.
now when it comes to writing, you, me, Ben, like us three, we're all, we're writers. We know we do this stuff. Like I put a lot of effort into figuring out why something is good, right? Like it is something I think is really interesting and really important to figure out. I am not a passive consumer of media
Mhm.
generally, so I watch a show or whatever and I enjoy it, and I'm like, okay, I enjoy it, but was it good?
Right.
This is always in the back of my head. It's like, did I enjoy it because I like certain themes or things and like it resonated with me, or was this actually good and should I recommend it and why?
Yep.
You know.
So you have the editor's voice
However,
going on.
yeah. However, I always consider it like the biggest compliment to any work, and that includes shows, books, whatever, is when I get so engrossed in it that I have completely forgotten to be critical of it. Now, this does
Yes.
not mean there are great books that I have, like, that editor's voice, like you said, is on the entire time, and I can explain to you, like, yeah, this is really working. But the very best are the ones where I am so invested in it that I have turned it off. I'm just that much into the work. It's very rare with me in particular, 'cause this is how I consume media. It's very
Right.
rare when this happens with me. It's happened with me, let's see, in Tolkien, the Battle of Pelennor Fields gets me every time, that section of the story. You know, you can explain why that section works, but you also can't, right? Like
Right.
your brain turns off, you're reading it. There's almost like a hushed silence cuz like you just read something that clearly, this is greatness. Like this is the high watermark of fantasy literature at that moment, in my opinion. And I've
And
done it
and
in like, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, and those are the things that when you're writing, you're trying to be mindful of those things that, quote unquote, throw the reader out of the story. I mean, if you have an anachronism in the story that it's a medieval
Yeah,
fantasy and they check their watch and suddenly every reader is going to be like, what? They check their watch? I don't think so. And they're no longer in the story, and that's bad. You want them so into the story that they have suspended belief. They're 100% believing that magic is real. They're not even questioning it as they read it, and they're not thinking about anything else. And yeah, it's great when you have an author who can do that. You wish there were more of them, but
yeah,
that's what sets the really great authors apart.
yeah. Literarily, it's happened very, very rarely with me. Like it's happened with Tolkien. It's happened with. Ooh, I'm trying to think. Oh, I'm trying. Nick Cole, is an author. If you've read him, I don't know. He's very good. He has a couple of works where I've had those moments where I'm so engrossed in the narrative that I'm not even thinking through it critically. In terms of
Right.
media I've watched, Full Metal, I've mentioned this a few times. I did it the last show. Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, the anime.
Mm.
There is one particular episode of the anime called Death of the Undying where I will always remember watching it for the first time because I remember watching the show and like getting so engrossed in this particular episode. There's like a plot twist in the middle of the episode, and I audibly gasped at the screen. When it happened, and then the
Right.
episode ended. I sat there for a moment with my jaw just on the floor, going like, "I think this is now my favorite show." Like, not sure I would have
Yeah.
picked this, but now it
Yeah.
is.
Well, but
Uh,
circling back to where we were earlier, I mean, when I was talking about dialogue and dialogue, which is so firmly dated and not in the context. So if you're watching, I don't know, Downton Abbey, and the dialogue is exactly what you would expect from the time period, then it's not a problem. But if you're reading Heinlein and it's supposed to be 100 years in the future, but the dialogue is 50 years in the past, then you've created a barrier between the work and the reader, and it's harder for the reader to get the feeling that you're exactly, what you're talking about is exactly right, because they're kind of like saying, this is a great story, but the dialogue just doesn't mesh perfectly. And so every time you have that barrier between the reader, what for whatever it is, and I could pick on Suetonius right now, because if you want to go back and read Aristophanes or Suetonius or any of the ancient writers, their writing style is just so different that it's harder to get immersed into it, because, as you were saying, translating in your mind, you're constantly kind of like reformulating the sentence structure to something that you're closer to. Um, and maybe Suetonius is too far away that you can't get at it like you can with Shakespeare, that suddenly, Shakespeare flows for you. And, if you're writing the original Latin and it doesn't matter, what order the words are, then you're at the mercy of the translator and how they do it. And it may make it harder for you to get those total immersion experiences.
yeah, exactly. It's Tolkien was really, really masterful at this, but they said part of the problem, and you mentioned this earlier, with like replicating Tolkien is virtually impossible for anyone to do. And you go, and that's not to say, so there's a difference between, are there lessons we can learn from Tolkien? Yes, there are, and there should be. And there's a great book called Writing Down the Dragon by Tom Simon that I think is really good at for that sort of thing, like figuring out what can we learn from Tolkien as writers. But can you imitate Tolkien, properly speaking? And the answer is that probably not. And the reason is, they said the verisimilitude of Tolkien's world, the reason that it felt so real is because, in a sense, it was. And they go, well, what do you mean by that? Well, what I mean is, when the characters are talking casually about things that have happened thousands of years ago, or whatever, or legends or things, these are legends that Tolkien already wrote for
Right.
their own sakes, that he didn't even necessarily expect anyone else to read. Maybe one day. Like, he wanted the Silmarillion published. He just never got it finished. But, so, I'm not saying he intended it to be private. Like, I think he would have wanted it to be seen one day or another. But, like, Tolkien created a world, created a backstory for fun on their own, with all of these stories and all of these languages. Infamously or famously, Tolkien created the languages and then created worlds to explain the languages, which is something that, like, literally nobody could do. Like, only Tolkien even can do that because he was a philologist.
Yeah.
The level
He
of
had the skill.
expertise it would take.
Yep.
Yeah, that level of expertise is just not possible among normal human beings. Like, you would need to
Well,
study for decades.
right, which he did, and
Yeah,
that's what allowed him to do it. But coming from the point of view of an author is, and maybe this is why I had such a hard time trying to rewrite that cynical story that I mentioned, is why would you really want to? I mean, because that's Tolkien's story. That's Tolkien's world.
yeah,
And I get fan fiction and all that sort of stuff. But if you're trying to create and tell your own stories, then you don't want to be telling Tolkien's stories. and maybe Tolkien's experiences can illuminate you and help you, but you don't want to do the same thing. I would think, I mean, the process for me, writing a story is a creative process. It's not an imitative process, or at least I hope not. I don't think it is. But you want to tell your own story, whatever story that is, rather than just regurgitate. And maybe I'm wrong, but maybe other people are like, all I really want to do is retell Tolkien, and that's enough for them. But for me, and for somebody who is truly trying to create their own story and characters, and if you're into fantasy, your own settings and things like that, then you don't want to replicate Tolkien.
Yep. You don't want to, and like that's the other thing with Tolkien, especially. Like you can't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. You
I
can
mean, and that's a
try,
good
but
reason
it
why
won't
you
work.
don't want to too, because you're not gonna make it. And as you say, we can definitely learn from Tolkien. We can be inspired by Tolkien. We can look at Tolkien and say, why are some of these things, what are some of the things that make him so good? And having this entire history underpinning the world. Um, the Mongoose and the Meerkat. So Mangos is a very forward-thinking person. In some ways, he starts off as a shallow character because he's young, and young people tend to be more self-centered than older people. So I'm not dwelling on the history of the world that he's in, but there is a history of the world that he's in. It's not nearly as mapped out as Tolkien did, but you have references to places that they have been, the history of those places. You have references to places in multiple stories that this is a real place. We hear about it in this story, and then we run into people who have actually been in it in this story, to try and bring some of that authenticity, that we can learn from Tolkien, because this worked very well for him. And you're not using the same stories or anything, but you're taking the idea and learning from it so that you can make your own stories better because of it.
That's a
Yeah. When
that's a good
I put
point.
together a series.
A lot of this
Go ahead.
stuff, comes down to studying and working hard. I've always just been a fan of classical music as classical music, but I understand why people need to study these things and study literature, especially to sort of gain a deeper appreciation. Um, it's not enough just to sort of like be a passive consumer. You have to be active within what's being provided. A lot of this stuff, you know, it doesn't come down to, oh, if I'm just good enough. It comes down to the study and the hard work and the grit and determination, that I think is definitely lacking, especially with AI, and the other stuff that we've been talking about all day. Whatever is decided, with that stuff, whether it advances to the point where people are just writing Ben Wheeler style stories or John C. Wright stories or whatever without paying us back for what we can, or whether we can even copyright a literary style. I think that might be questions that will be answered into the future, especially as these things develop. But I keep on thinking that, wouldn't it be fun? Take an author who you suspect of being an AI user, sit him down, and it's like give him a replicant test like in Blade Runner. It's like, you see it. Write me a short story about a turtle that's upside down. What
Yeah,
do you mean? It's like, can't do it, huh? And then I
yeah,
shoot
we're
them
gonna
dead.
quiz you
But
on your own works.
right, absolutely.
Yeah, well, and I do think that, you mentioned passive consumer, and as a consumer, if you will, of fiction or music or something like that, I find my appreciation is greater the more I know about it. I mean, like I'm using Mozart earlier as an example. I mean, I appreciate Mozart so much more because now I know why he was a genius. Rather than having somebody tell me he's a genius only goes so far, but understanding what skill and dedication goes into it, so that I recognize that when somebody, like springs a great scene on me in writing, I can say, oh my gosh, that's a great scene. And I recognize it as a
Mic
great
off.
scene. And they had to do this, that, and the other thing to make it a great scene. And wow, I respect them as a writer because they knew
Mic on.
what it takes to make a great scene. And that brings a whole new level of appreciation to your reading or your listening or your viewing when you can do that.
Yep. It's for me, it's all more narrative than anything else. Knowing the narrative of the song, or having it tied with something I hold in high regard, is stronger to me than the individual parts, or even the authorial intent. Um, like in one case, it's with Prokofiev's The Dance of Nights, and other waltzes. I don't actually look deeper into them because I just love the music for its own sake, to be moved around in the motions, with others imaginarily, spinning around, yet not getting dizzy, holding on to someone you love. That's a power in and of itself. And
Yeah.
however, while we do not believe quality is subjective, it's certain, however much enjoyment you get out of it is certainly subjective for some things. Um,
Uh, and even if you can look at some things and measure quality by absolute standards, whether it's durability or functionality or something like that, there is a subjective component to pleasure which nobody should be able to take away from you. I
mm,
mean, you can look at high-end lobster mac and cheese and say this is objectively better than Kraft macaroni and cheese from a box. But if you grew up eating Kraft macaroni and cheese from a box and you associate it with home and childhood and carefree life, and you like it because of those nostalgic feelings, nobody should have the right to tell you that you are a lesser person or wrong for liking the Kraft macaroni and cheese.
no,
You
no,
know,
no, 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 no.
you know,
I disagree.
and
I completely disagree. There's a certain amount of enjoyment for it, yeah, absolutely. But don't forget that there's people in New York and other places who look down on us for enjoying the very stories that we write.
oh,
And
sure, they do, and
but they prefer stories that are essentially, masturbatory fic about a single woman in New York struggling to make it big, while the trust fund money comes in. It's like, listen, I'm not here to read stories about myself or about some mythical idea that the editors just love for some reason. But like, their enjoyment is not equal to my enjoyment or your enjoyment.
no.
It's
Well, but so what the point I was trying to make is not that the enjoyment is equal or unequal, because I'm sure that there are stories that I despise that other people love. It's just trying to make the point that there can be a story that is dings all the literary, bells and whistles and all that, but it, whether or not you enjoy it is for you to determine, not for somebody in an ivory tower to determine. And there's a lot of different types of writing that fit a lot of different types of needs. And just because I won't even name an author because I don't want to pick on somebody's favorite author, but just because my beach reading is
right.
not great literature doesn't mean there isn't a place for that beach reading, and it doesn't mean that I don't enjoy it, even though it's not great literature.
Right. There's the eternal quality of a book versus the personal enjoyment of a book is different, but
Exactly. That's
it's
what I was getting at.
it's like with the Kraft macaroni and cheese thing, it's like, yeah, sure, I can see why people enjoy that, but I've also had real macaroni and cheese.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I despise Kraft macaroni and cheese. I'm not a Kraft fan, but I'm also not going to be the person who tells somebody that they have no right to like Kraft macaroni and cheese, because if they do, that's entirely up to them. It's not for me to tell them what to like or dislike.
oh well. So yeah,
I might judge them a little bit by it,
yeah,
but I don't have.
yeah. It's yeah. I think I think we'll be better off as an art culture when people kind of feel out that difference a bit better, because there are books out there, that we can say, look, this book is essentially pornography. You are not a good
Yeah,
person for reading this. Do not bring it in. Do not bring it
yeah,
around. The AI that's just copying, that's pulling DNA out of Terry Brooks's, corpse or whatever, isn't going to be Terry Brooks. Please stop
right.
even pretending.
Well,
Uh,
it'd be nice. I mean, and I could, I could go there. If somebody's hanging something on the wall, and I could say, please don't put the Black Velvet Elvis on the wall. That's just trash.
right.
Uh, eh, but at the end of the day, they're going to put what they want on the wall, and
Sure.
so long. You know.
I'm promoting gatekeeping on this show. That's all I'm
Well,
gonna say. Yeah.
nope, then that's fine because traditionally that's the role of editors and things like that
Yeah.
because gatekeeping is that's you needed a publisher to get published. Gatekeeping is actually a little bit on the downswing, I think, because it's so easy for anybody to put their stuff out there without any gatekeeping at all that you see the good, the bad, and the abominable.
Yep. Yep. No argument from me. And uh, of course, part of my role as a mini gatekeeper uh, is to promote the good, the beautiful, and the true. And Cat is pretty beautiful. I wouldn't call them good, but it's certainly true that this is a Kickstarter that anyone can enjoy. And I've brought it all the way back to the central thing.
The
Once
circle is complete.
once again, no matter how far the circle goes out, I can bring it in one last time. Uh,
Excellent.
and in that case, I certainly have a hearty and full recommend for Mongoose and Meerkat. I will certainly be picking up a paperback version of it sometime before the Kickstarter is up. You have 1 week left. Still want to get some money for this so that we can continue to produce fantastic works. Kursova, Jim Breyfogle, and others as well. Um, Jim, do you have any last words for us?
No, thank you for that rousing send off. I appreciate it, and hopefully the conversation before we went off the Mongoose and Meerkat and got into other interesting topics, but hopefully maybe got a couple people interested enough that they'll give it a try, and I hope they will, and I hope they enjoy it.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. The promotion of this stuff is one of the main reasons, the etra of this show, and it's quite well fulfilled. And to all our viewers, thank you, and have a wonderful evening. All right.